Maybe we should be concerned about this. And, what'd you hear? Crickets. They will tell you, it's amusing because the Harvard School of Public Health, on the one side of their mouth, they will tell you to eat seed oils. And on the other side of their mouth, they will tell you not to eat fried foods. What are fried foods cooked in? Seed oils. So make up your mind. Are they good or bad for you? Right?
I'm interested, Tucker. So what makes the omega-6 oils? What about their structure? Because you did talk about their molecular structure. So what is it about their structure that makes them more prone to oxidation compared with omega-3 oils?
It's interesting. Omega-3 oils are actually more susceptible typically to oxidation, which is why fish go bad so quickly, right? What smell of a rotting fish is the smell of rancid omega-3 fats. The things that omega-3 fats break down into, the aldehydes and oxidation byproducts, are not as toxic as the ones from omega-6 fats. They are still toxic, but they are like several orders of magnitude less toxic. So, you should also avoid rancid omega-3 fats. Obviously, that's easy to do because you can smell them. Rancid omega-6 fats are used preferentially in processed foods because people don't really smell them, right? It gives a stale flavor. It doesn't smell, like a rotting fish. So people are still willing to eat rancid omega-6 fats in like a bag of potato chips. And if you ever have, pulled a bag of nuts out of your closet and you realize, oops, I put this in here last year, and you smell them, you will smell the smell of rancid omega-6. And it's just this kind of stale, flat smell. It's not obviously objectionable. So it's, the problem is the toxins that they break into are far more damaging to your body. They're two of the major ones, malondialdehyde and HNE, are both genotoxic. They both induce genetic mutations in vivo and are very implicated. I mean, HNE was originally discovered when they were studying cancer, and they kept coming across this molecule and tried to figure out where it came from and realized, it comes from omega-6 fats exclusively. So I talk about that a lot because it is a really good marker. And the only place that it comes from is from a fat that you can only get from your diet, right? So into your mouth, into your cells, breaks down genetic damage. And some of the common markers that are used for genetic damage are markers that are dependent on damage from oxidized omega-6 fats.
So for people who take their omega-6s and 3s from real foods like fish and nuts, if they're tolerated, I believe the recommendation is keeping it in a ratio of 1:1. Is that correct?
That's 1:1 to 1:3 is probably what you get in an ancestral population. Look, I mean, so it's important to note the reason that these were recommended to us originally was because omega-6 fats have the property of lowering your cholesterol, specifically your LDL cholesterol, right? This was initially thought to be a good thing and is still promoted as a good thing, which is why the canola oil has a heart healthy label on it, right? However, they didn't actually test it when they made the recommendations. When they got around to testing it on humans, what they discovered was that, yes, it does lower your LDL, but it also gives you higher rates of heart disease. And the most famous of these tests was something called the Minnesota coronary experiment, which was conducted by a gentleman named Ansel Keys, who was the primary promoter of this idea that polyunsaturated omega-6 fats are good for your heart. He ran this test, and what they found was that the degree of harm was commensurate with the amount of LDL lowering. So the people who had the biggest effect had the worst outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. So nuts also lower LDL cholesterol. That's often why they are sold as a healthy food. So I would be careful about consuming too much nuts or peanuts, you know, anything with omega-6 fats. For fish, you know, you don't need a lot of these fats, right? You don't need a lot of omega-3 fats. So eat fish occasionally. Pork that has been fed a lot of omega-6 fats also has the property of lowering LDL. So I consider lowering LDL to be a sign of an unhealthy food, right? It is damaging a fundamental process in your body. We're not entirely clear as to why it lowers the LDL, but the negative effects that go along with that have been pretty clearly demonstrated in human experiments. So I would be careful of any food that lowers your LDL.
So this is
and
probably.
So what we also didn't know is that what causes LDL to cause. LDL is involved in the process of heart disease. There's no question about it. This was demonstrated. The first step in atherosclerosis is the formation of what's called foam cells, which is a white blood cell that has gorged itself on fat and cholesterol, right? And the scientists who got the Nobel Prize for discovering the LDL receptor promptly turned around and said, okay, well, let's demonstrate that LDL starts heart disease, starts atherosclerosis. So they incubated some white blood cells with some LDL and nothing happened. Oops. So what they realized was that the LDL had to be modified. And then the macrophages would gorge and become foam cells. But the modification they used wasn't something that happens in the body. So some other researchers discovered the modification that happens in the body. And what is it? It is the oxidation of the omega-6 fats in the LDL, converts it into what's called an oxidized LDL, ox-LDL. And ox-LDL induces macrophages to become foam cells and kicks off the atherosclerosis process, right? They experimented in rabbits and they experimented in humans, and they showed that if you compare olive oil to a seed oil, olive oil makes the LDL extremely resistant to oxidation because it's low in omega-6 fats. The seed oils make it extremely susceptible to oxidation because they are high in omega-6 fats. And that was done in the 1980s and is the only explanation for the process of atherosclerosis in the cardiovascular literature. Other things that are involved in heart disease, like smoking, for instance, are involved in this process because they also kick off the oxidation of these omega-6 fats in your blood.
Fascinating. Well, you did mention for people who like to enjoy nuts occasionally, you did mention the macadamia nuts being, yes, and me too, being the safest as far as their omega-6 fats are concerned.
But you talked about nuts traditionally would be a seasonal food, obviously, right? There's a season for nuts. Nuts are hard to get at. Dr. Michael Eads wrote a fantastic article on his blog about his adventures in getting nuts when he was a kid in Arkansas. And I think they were pecans. And he said to shell pecans, he would pick them off the tree, put them in a burlap bag, and run over them with his pickup truck. Cavemen didn't have pickup trucks, right? It was hard to get a lot of nuts. And traditional populations, we discussed rice bran oil. One of the reasons that Asians eat white rice is because the omega-6 fat in rice, the rice bran oil, is in the bran, right? That's the brown part of the rice. So white rice has the omega-6 fats removed. And they did that because otherwise it goes rancid very quickly. Right? That's why white rice is one of the better grains to eat because it's one of the lowest in omega-6 content because the omega-6 has been removed.
Albeit it's not perfect for diabetics.
Well, if you have a glucose intolerance, that's an entirely different story.
The blood sugars would be affected.
Yeah. No, white rice is like the next best thing. Yeah, after pure glucose, I think white rice is the most effective thing for raising your blood sugar.
So we talked about the vegetable oils, seed oils. Let's go about the saturated fats, as in, you did mention lard.
Oh, you asked me about the molecular structure, right? So basically the difference is a saturated fat is a line of carbon atoms with hydrogen atoms on each side. It looks sort of like a ladder with a bar down the middle of carbon atoms, right? A monounsaturated fat, like oleic acid, the fat in olive oil, has a single hydrogen atom missing, right? Which creates what's called a double bond between the two carbon atoms, which all of this sounds exciting, but and then a polyunsaturated fat has two or more missing hydrogen atoms. So two or more double bonds, right? Those missing hydrogen atoms basically make the fat molecule susceptible to being oxidized by an oxygen molecule, right? And when it's oxidized, typically the fat molecule breaks up into components, and the components can be charged and highly bioactive, highly chemically active, right? That's why things like HNE are so damaging in the body, because once the fat breaks down, basically breaks in half, and one half of it is an HNE molecule, it can go on and damage other fats, right? To continue this oxidation process. It can also damage proteins and, of course, DNA. So it causes an enormous amount of damage. I saw one paper that said that HNE can damage up to 24% of the proteins in a cell, right? So a quarter of the proteins get damaged. And when proteins get damaged, they don't work well. And typically the proteins that get damaged are the ones that are involved in energy production, because this process of the omega-6 fats breaking down happens inside your mitochondria, and it causes inability to produce energy and inability, to process glucose correctly. HNE itself directly causes insulin resistance in the cell, and can cause, one of the things that's typical of a cancer cell is it's unable to burn glucose. That breakdown in the cell can be caused by HNE directly. So it's one of the reasons that they think that seed oils are so intimately involved with the Western cancers, is that it's causing all the damage that you see in the cancer cells.
Fascinating. So how about sort of fat from beef? But before we discuss that, you did mention that if the pigs have been exposed to feed high in linoleic acid, then you should avoid lard. But otherwise, grass-fed pigs, for example, or I know that in the UK, for example, most pastured pigs, they're fine. I mean, in the UK, we don't have the same sort of problem. Oh, in most of Europe, have the same level of problem. So lard is okay.
Yeah, outside the United States, pork is pretty well associated with good health, and lard, is a healthy fat. In the United States, typically they hydrogenate it because it has so much linoleic acid that it wouldn't even be solid. A lot of people use bacon grease, and I used to try to use bacon grease, but too often it would just, a healthy fat is, so what makes a fat go solid is the saturated fats, right? So a healthy pig should produce a bacon grease that is going to be firm at room temperature. If it is liquid at room temperature, it is liquid because it has been fed lots of linoleic acid, right? So that's an easy test. Lots of people use the fridge test. The fridge test doesn't really work for oils. Because it depends on how much saturated fat's in the oil. And even in like olive oil, you can I've tried this experiment with two olive oils from the same company, put them side by side in the fridge, and one of them goes solid and the other one doesn't. And it's just an indication of how much saturated fat is in the two bottles. So don't rely on that. But yeah, lard is, lard, I would say outside the United States is fine. Oddly enough, hydrogenating these fats probably makes them better for you, with the caveat that trans fats are not synthetic trans fats are not good for you. But, Crisco was originally marketed as being more easily digestible. And in fact, was marketed because it had less linoleic acid, because they were hydrogenating the linoleic acid and making it less subject to going rancid. Back in 1911, they knew a thing or two back then. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, they also had a lot of trans fats in it, so that wasn't a good thing.
So let's talk about tallow and ghee and all the rest.
Yeah, tallow is great. Ruminants are very different. So a ruminant has 4 stomachs, right? Humans, pigs, and chickens are all what we call monogastrics. We have a single stomach. A ruminant is protected from omega-6 fats because the microbes in their rumen will digest these fats into more beneficial fats, like conjugated linoleic acid, which is thought to have some anti-cancer properties, interestingly enough. It has a different structure than linoleic acid. So ruminants, even if you grain finish a beef, then it is going to have a little bit more omega-6 fats, but it's a tiny amount compared to a grain-fed pig or a grain-fed chicken. So even, I prefer grass-fed meat myself. I think it tastes better. The fatty acid balance is better, but it's not enough of a difference, frankly, for it to be worth the premium. So, if you can't afford it, don't worry about it. Eat the grain finished beef and then eat a little bit of fish every so often to get the extra omega-3 fats. So yeah, tallow's good. You want it to be, ideally firm. I got a 5-gallon drum once upon a time full of tallow to use in deep frying, and I had to use a chisel to get the tallow out. It was literally the consistency of a bar of soap or a candle. Ghee is great. Ghee, again, is butter, is a traditional fat in India and is what Indians ate before they had an epidemic of obesity and type 2 diabetes. And I don't think that is a coincidence. Ghee's great. Butter's great. Butter is what, butter and ghee is what the Indians were eating for thousands of years. It's interesting. The Indians actually were the ones who first identified type 2 and type 1 diabetes 2,000 odd years ago. And they were also the first people who started consuming seed oils. And I don't think it's a coincidence. The only primitive hunter-gatherer group that we know of that has insulin resistance are the only ones that eat a diet high in nuts. Back to your nut question, right? This is the Bushmen who eat a high omega-6 nut called the mungongo nut. And when they are tested, when they give them an oral glucose tolerance test in mungongo nut season, they fail. Oops.
Okay, so you mentioned the flammability aspect of all these vegetable oils, right? That was interesting, right?
Isn't that crazy?
Part of the chef's apron would actually catch fire because of the oils.
And yeah, omega-3 fats are even worse. Flaxseed is linseed oil. And linseed oil, if you soak a rag in linseed oil and leave it out in the sun, it will burst into flames. There's a video on YouTube showing this, right? So when I was growing up and doing furniture refinishing, my dad was like, oh, we got to be really careful people burn their house down because they leave these rags in the garage, right? It happens pretty regularly. And I talked to a scientist who was talking about genetically modifying plants and to produce, better fat ratios. And he said they can't genetically modify a plant to produce more omega-3 fats because the plant would burst into flames. Isn't that ridiculous?
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. But I'm wondering if that flammability aspect is or the shares a common cause with why people get sunburn.
Well,
consuming these oils.
Yeah. So sunburn is your tissues. Well, let me not get back up too far. Yeah. So what happened to me with sunburn? Let's talk about that first. So, if you can't see the screen right now. I am blonde, blue-eyed, very fair-skinned. I was very susceptible to sunburn for most of my life. I would turn into a tomato in about 45 minutes. And as a result, I would desperately avoid the beach or any extended sun exposure. And I just thought this was normal. And I was quite pissed off at my genetic heritage for leaving me in a condition where I couldn't exist on the planet I was born on. Unless I ran from shadow to shadow, you know, it was kind of annoying. So after I fixed my diet, I went skiing. Oh, and I hate sunscreen. So I hardly ever use sunscreen. So after I fixed my diet, I went out skiing one day. And at the end, you know, no sunscreen, bluebird day in March, gorgeous day for skiing. And I woke up the next morning and I looked in the mirror and I didn't have a burn. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Didn't really think about it. And then I had heard an anecdote about some guy who said he went on the paleo diet or the primal diet. Actually, it was on Mark Sisson's website, and that he became resistant to sunburn. And I was like, that's crazy. And then what actually got me, so let me not jump too far ahead. So then my ex-wife was Colombian, dark skin, and she and I went to an outdoor event in Central Park in New York City in April, a couple of weeks after my skiing experience. And we stood in the sun for 2.5 hours, side by side, right? Neither one of us had sunscreen on. And when we got home, she said, look at the burn I got. And I looked at myself and I looked in the mirror and I said, I didn't burn. Now, this was the first time that we had been out together in the sun and I had not burned and she had. So this was kind of a come to Jesus moment, if you want to call it. It's what convinced her that this was something, right? So that was 12 years ago. I've used sunscreen once since then. I currently live in Idaho in the high desert and do a lot of running and backpacking. I will get a sunburn, but it used to take 45 minutes. Now it takes about 7 hours. And whereas I used to have sheets of skin coming off, now it's just, you know, flakes, very little pain. Pain goes away overnight. And usually I just turn brown. When I get burned, it's when I go out and I get, 7 hours of sunburn exposure first thing in the season. Right? Obviously, be smart about it. Expose yourself gradually, don't. But the difference for me has been life altering. I mean, when I was living in Texas, I would go out for 3 or 4 hours on mountain bike rides, no sunscreen, and I would come back a little pink and I'd be tan the next morning. It's been night and day. So why does this happen? The omega-6 fats are so susceptible to damage that not only ultraviolet light, but blue light is enough to break them down, right? So when they break down into that chemical. They've tracked this in humans, right? By exposing the skin to sunlight and then seeing what changes in the skin. And the toxic chemical HNE is increased in sunburn, and HNE directly induces inflammation in the body, right? And cell damage, cell death, all of the symptoms of a sunburn, essentially. So what is happening is the omega-6 fats in your skin are breaking down into a toxin, an inflammatory toxin, right? This also happens in your eyes with blue light, which is why we have the leading cause of blindness. Age-related macular degeneration is caused by blue light breaking omega-6 fats down in your eye, which damages the retina. That's one of the few medical conditions I know of where doctors will recommend that a low omega-6 diet will prevent that disease. And that is, again, the leading cause of blindness. So it is not too far to go to say that omega-6 fats are the leading cause of blindness. That's an eye-opener. And now, mind you, lots of folks go on a low-carb diet and eat a lot of mayonnaise with soybean oil and all of this other stuff you are not protecting yourself against any of these effects when you do that, right?